The Congressional Black Caucus is going after Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene over comments she made accusing Democrats of worshiping George Floyd, the black man who was killed by a Minneapolis police officer in 2020. His death sparked the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, of course. Let's listen to what MTG said that fueled the backlash.
We have Jamie Raskin in there accusing us of worshiping Trump, worshiping as a convicted felon.
He is a convicted
Well, yeah, so is George Floyd. And everybody, and you all too, the media worship George Floyd. Democrats worship George Floyd. There were riots burning down the country over George Floyd, and Raskin is in there saying we worship him. Excuse me, let me correct you, and this is really important. I don't worship, I worship God.
The Congressional Black Caucus responded on X, writing, "This is unhinged even for Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. Her actions are unacceptable, even by the lowest of Republican standards. George Floyd did not deserve to die, and a member of Congress should have the decency to acknowledge his humanity."
Greene's comments were made to reporters on Monday after the House subcommittee hearing on the origins of COVID-19. Many users on X are weighing in on the spat between MTG and the Congressional Black Caucus. One writing, quote, "Both parties still using George Floyd as talking points just proves you all are still using the same script from the pandemic," unquote. Another, "Good for you, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. Keep putting the establishment in their place and hold nothing back. More of this, please, ma'am." And yet another saying, "If you don't want people saying you worship Donald Trump, stop worshipping Donald Trump. Democrats never nominated George Floyd to be president. People were outraged at how the police handled the situation leading to his death."
Yeah, and that really does seem to be the point there. Whether or not you think that there should be more or less scrutiny over how George Floyd lived his life, the reason people came to his defense and he became a kind of inspiration for those riots were not because of who he was as a person, but because he was a person who had a life that has intrinsic value and rights that are inalienable. And we watched him get murdered on camera by a police officer. It was a reaction to his untimely death and the use of disproportionate force, not a random selection of a human being from the masses of Americans to put on a pedestal. I also think it would be wrong for a police officer to kneel on Donald Trump's neck for 8 minutes and kill him on camera, even though he is a convicted felon, not in quotation marks, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Right. That does not mean he deserves to be murdered by an agent of the state.
Right. I mean, George Floyd's history is irrelevant to what actually happened to him. And one of the reasons it was so shocking and sparked those protests is we all saw what happened to him, which was a police officer kneeling on his neck until he died, until that police officer killed him. That was so obviously egregious that the police officer in question was subsequently convicted of murder. Now, that is what people were protesting, those chain of events. What had happened 1 or 5 or 10 years previously in George Floyd's life is irrelevant to that question. Now, when it comes to Mr. Trump, he is a felon not only because he has been found by a jury of his peers to have falsified business records, but because the prosecution's case, which was accepted by that jury, was that he had done so with the intent of influencing an election. And it is against that backdrop that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene are very strongly commending Mr. Trump to be president of the United States again.
Yeah, well said. I mean, what do you make of this argument, though, that having debates about George Floyd feels very 2020 in an election cycle where we're literally stuck with the same candidates from 2020? Is this kind of like a weird regressive move, both from Marjorie Taylor Greene in bringing some of the first plays, and maybe also for the Democrats who seem to have a little bit of eagerness to fight on this particular battlefield?
I think there are political reasons why Marjorie Taylor Greene is doing it. I mean, I think she regards those issues that are not, I mean, I think it's sanitizing to say sort of culture war. They're racial issues or racially based issues. And I assume she's aware, at least, of the perception that the Black Lives Matter movement sort of lost momentum sometime after that, or became less salient to the political debate. And so it has become, I think Black Lives Matter is one of those terms that has, in conservative circles, become just increasingly one of those labels that you throw out to bespeak radicalism or quote-unquote extremism. Woke.
DEI.
Exactly.
Critical race theory.
Right.
I almost forgot that one because that was the first one from yesteryear.
Right, and so those things have formed a kind of lexicon that if you're a Marjorie Taylor Greene type figure, you throw out in the expectation that your voters, at least, are going to react in a certain way. Now, obviously, and to sort of make that clear, that is not to say that we shouldn't have debates about race, about policing, about the justice system, about any of that, but that's not why Marjorie Taylor Greene's doing it.
Yeah, it's also interesting to think about how we spoke in another segment about, in an immigration segment, about whether or not Joe Biden's choice to try to run away from the issue of immigration basically left the floor open for Republicans to really dominate on that and get us to a point where Biden is now trying to dig himself out of the perception that he and Democrats are bad on immigration by basically adopting wholesale large swaths of Republican immigration plans, and how that typically doesn't work. There's this study from Oxford that says that typically doesn't work. And I'm now thinking about that in this context and how popular the 2020 protests were, how more people participated in them than any protest in American history, how even when pretty radical things happen, like the Minneapolis Police Department getting burnt down, polls in the immediate aftermath supported the burning down of a police station. That's how incensed the general public was about what they had just witnessed with George Floyd being killed on camera. And how, when you allude to the death of that movement, I see it as really closely linked to the fact that all of that was happening during an election year where Joe Biden, again, saw the protests as a political liability, even when they were much more popular than they are now, and was running on fund the police more when there was a defund the police movement happening, and during which activists were being kind of told and messaged to that this can hurt the president. You should sit back. Like, you shouldn't force this issue. You can't try to link your goals with criminal justice reform to President Biden's agenda, because it will prevent him from being able to win an election. And how much damage Biden's pushback against the movement during the summer of 2020 created a world in which the movement basically died. It couldn't be, we had to choose basically, do you want another term of Trump, or do you want police justice reform, criminal justice reform, so you don't see cops killing citizens in the street? And America made its choice. So there is some irony to me to have all of these Democrats now wanting to make a fight with Marjorie Taylor Greene over George Floyd, when Joe Biden just like a week or two ago announced a huge new round of funding for American police officers, the guy that you're endorsing and that you're pushing for president.
I take that point, and but I think we're in a way back to some of the discussion we had about immigration, because here's the thing that I feel about George Floyd and defund the police and the electoral consequences of that. There are people who looked at what happened to George Floyd and they thought that is emblematic of a much bigger problem with American policing, with how it deals with issues of race, with a kind of impunity with which the police can act, and therefore we need to defund the police. I think a lot of other people thought, that's terrible that black guy just got murdered by a police officer, and they didn't necessarily buy that broader critique or that leftist critique, or believe that it required a defunding of the police.
Sure, and I didn't expect Joe Biden to be running on defund the police, but I think there's a wide gap between saying there's millions of people protesting in the street, so let me say, of course we need to have police reform, of course we need to look at the root causes of safety, and in fact, throwing money at police departments doesn't have a correlation between public safety. We need to hold police officers accountable, including with how they're using public funds. There's a kind of like libertarian fiscal responsibility argument in there, and we saw that with Trump and the Stop his police reform act that he and Van Jones worked on when he was
Right.
in office. He could have taken that approach, but instead there's this wild swing to the other direction that seems to be a bid to draw Republican votes in. That says, no, I'm going to fund the police more.
Right.
We need more police funding. That's really what would solve this problem. And I suspect that didn't get him a single extra vote.
Right.
But now we live in a world where it became, frankly, toxic at a certain time to really articulate what your values were because they were seen as hurting Biden's ability to beat Trump in 2020.
And to your point, I mean, there are so many constituencies in this country that are crying out for change of one kind or another. And when you back away from that change, or when you simply fail to accomplish it, I think that does contribute to some of the apathy, some of the lack of enthusiasm we're seeing for Biden's re-election among not only the black community, but among lots of critical constituencies in the Democratic coalition.
Yeah, there's just reporting that the Sunrise Movement that did endorse Biden in 2020, much to my chagrin, frankly, is withholding their endorsement, at least for now, precisely because they see him as having reneged on his commitments to the climate movement. Are they going to be knocking doors for you? Is that going to really hurt you downstream? We will see. Stick around. We've got more Rising coming up next.